At the docks of Waterford in the biting winter of 1846, heavily armed dragoons stood watch over a convoy of wagons. The cargo was not gold, nor munitions, but grain, butter, and livestock, bound for the holds of ships destined for English ports. Just beyond the bayonets of the soldiers, a skeletal crowd watched in agonizing silence. Their skin was stretched taut over bone, their eyes hollowed by an absolute consuming hunger. This was not a nation devoid of food. It was a nation where food was a commodity for the empire and starvation was the terrifying cost of doing business. The nightmare had begun a year earlier in 1845 with a whisper of rot on the wind. A mysterious pathogen, a water mold known scientifically as Phytophthora infestans, had crossed the Atlantic in the holds of merchant vessels. When it reached the fertile, damp soil of the island, it found a perfect, tragic vulnerability. A vast majority of the rural population relied on a single crop for their very survival: the lumper potato. It was a monoculture dictated not by preference, but by the brutal mathematics of colonial land ownership. When the potato blight struck, it did not merely stunt the crop, it liquefied. Its families went to sleep anticipating a meager harvest, only to wake to fields entirely blackened, emitting a sickening sweet stench of decay. The earth itself seemed to have turned against them. Digging into the soil revealed only putrid, oozing slime. For the cottiers and laborers who subsisted on little else, the vanishing of the potato meant the immediate vanishing of tomorrow. There was no reserve, no backup plan, and no mercy from the land. The devastation rapidly consumed the western and southern provinces, turning vibrant, densely populated valleys into landscapes of creeping dread. From the rugged coastlines of Galway to the fertile plains of Munster, a uniform terror took hold. Markets that once bustled with the meager trade of the rural poor fell deathly quiet. The creeping realization that the rot was ubiquitous paralyzed communities. No village was spared the sudden violent erasure of their sole means of sustenance. This catastrophic agricultural failure was weaponized by a deeply entrenched British colonial policy. For centuries, the native population had been systematically stripped of land ownership through penal laws and confiscations. The soil they worked belonged largely to absentee landlords residing in London or Dublin, men who viewed their estates merely as ledgers of profit. The Irish tenant farmer was forced to grow cash crops like wheat and oats to pay exorbitant rents, leaving only the smallest, poorest plots for the potatoes that kept their own children alive. As the primary food source dissolved into the earth, the demands of the landlords remained rigidly inflexible. Rent was still due. The oats, the barley, and the cattle raised by starving hands were demanded as payment to eat. The cash crop was to face immediate eviction, a death sentence just as certain as the famine itself. Thus, the tenants harvested the grain, loaded it onto carts, and watched it roll away toward the ports, fulfilling their economic obligations while their own bodies began to consume themselves. It is here that the true, horrific truth of the Great Irish Famine begins to truly unfold. While millions descended into the agonizing throes of malnutrition, Ireland continued to export massive quantities of food. Historical records show that during the darkest years of the crisis, dozens of ships departed daily, their holds bursting with beans, onions, rabbits, salmon, and honey. The starvation was not a result of a total lack of food on the island, but an artificial scarcity enforced by the barrel of a gun. The government in Westminster approached the crisis through the rigid, unyielding lens of laissez-faire economics. This doctrine, meaning let it be, dictated that the free market must never be interfered with, even in the face of mass death. Bureaucrats argued that providing free food to the starving would artificially depress agricultural prices and harm the profits of merchants. To the architects of this policy, economic theory was sacred, and human lives were a highly acceptable casualty in the defense of market equilibrium. Imagine the profound psychological torture of this existence: a father, physically wasting away, forced to butcher a fat calf that he knows will be entirely consumed by strangers across the sea. The torment of smelling baking bread from a heavily guarded granary, knowing that a single stolen loaf would result in imprisonment or transportation to a penal colony. The cruelty of the situation was not merely physical. It was a soul-crushing indignity that weaponized the law against the fundamental human right to exist. The biological reality of starvation is a slow, humiliating degradation. First comes the gnawing pain, followed by a profound lethargy as the body begins to metabolize its own muscle tissue for energy. The skin takes on a yellowish, translucent pallor, and the limbs swell with edema. Children, Their growth stunted, developed hollow, aged faces, their cries reduced to weak, raspy whimpers. People were found dead in ditches, their mouths stained green from desperately chewing on grass, nettles, and weeds in a futile attempt to trick their empty stomachs. In a grudging concession to the mounting death toll, the government expanded the workhouse system, governed by the harsh dictates of the poor law. These towering, grim stone structures were deliberately designed to be as unappealing as possible, operating on the principle that relief should be more miserable than the lowest-paying labor. Families entering the workhouse were immediately separated by sex and age, stripping them of their final source of comfort. They traded their freedom and their dignity for a bowl of watered-down soup. These institutions quickly mutated into overcrowded charnel houses, with immune systems decimated by severe malnutrition. The inmates became perfect hosts for opportunistic infections. Typhus, known colloquially as black fever, and relapsing fever swept through the unventilated wards with terrifying speed. Dysentery, a horrific disease that dehydrates and destroys the intestinal lining, claimed tens of thousands who had survived the initial lack of food. The workhouses, intended as a last refuge, became highly efficient engines of mortality. Overseeing this catastrophe was Charles Trevelyan, the British civil servant in charge of famine relief. Trevelyan viewed the Blight not as a humanitarian disaster, but as a divine intervention. He infamously described the famine as the direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence, designed to correct the supposed moral failings and overpopulation of the peasantry. This chilling ideological framework allowed the government to justify the withholding of meaningful aid, framing mass starvation as a necessary, even righteous social correction. Driven by this punitive philosophy, the state instituted a system of public works, forcing the starving to perform hard labor in exchange for pennies. Across the freezing rain-swept countryside, skeletal men and women were tasked with breaking rocks and building roads that led absolutely nowhere. These famine roads still scar the landscape today, monuments to a bureaucracy that demanded physical exertion from bodies that were actively shutting down. Workers frequently collapsed and died mid-swing, their tools slipping from emaciated fingers into the mud. The winter of 1846 to 1847, known as Black 47, brought a new level of atmospheric horror. It was one of the coldest winters in recorded memory, burying the island in deep, paralyzing snow. Those who had pawned their clothing and blankets for a handful of meal were left entirely exposed to the elements. Entire families huddled together in unheated cabins, their body heat slowly fading into the freezing air until the stillness of frost claimed them entirely. The sheer volume of the dead soon overwhelmed the rituals of the living. Graveyards filled beyond capacity, forcing communities to abandon the deeply held traditions of wakes and proper burials. Corpses were buried without coffins in mass pits, sometimes with trapdoor coffins used merely to transport the body before dropping it into the earth and returning for the next. In many remote areas, the dead were simply left where they fell, their cabins pulled down over them to serve as makeshift collapsing tombs. As the crisis deepened, landlords seized the opportunity to clear their estates of unprofitable tenants. The quarter-acre clause was enacted, stating that anyone occupying more than a quarter-acre of land was ineligible for public relief. To get a bowl of soup, a farmer had to legally surrender his farm. Those who refused faced violent eviction. Heavily armed constabulary forces arrived with battering rams, tearing off thatched roofs and tumbling the stone walls, casting families out into the freezing ditches to perish. Faced with the absolute certainty of death by starvation or disease, millions made the desperate choice to flee. Emigration transformed from a steady trickle into a frantic, chaotic exodus. People walked for days to reach the ports of Dublin, Cork, and Liverpool, clutching whatever meager savings they could scrape together. They were leaving behind everything they knew, driven by a primal instinct to survive, stepping onto the rotting planks of vessels that offered only a marginal chance of salvation. The vessels that carried them across the Atlantic earned the grim moniker of coffin ships. Often retrofitted timber carriers, these ships were dangerously overcrowded, poorly provisioned, and entirely unregulated. Below decks, in the suffocating darkness of the steerage hold, hundreds of weakened, terrified passengers were crammed into wooden bunks. There was little ventilation, no sanitation, and only rancid water to drink. The crossing could take up to 6 weeks, a grueling voyage through violent storms and freezing swells. In the damp, putrid air of the hold, ship fever thrived. Typhus raged through the tightly packed bodies, transforming the voyage into a floating nightmare. The dead were hastily sewn into canvas sacks and cast over the side into the dark waters of the Atlantic. On some vessels, up to a third of the passengers perished before ever seeing the shoreline of North America. The survivors arrived in quarantine stations like Grosse Ile in Canada, skeletal specters carrying the trauma of unimaginable loss. Back on the island, the silence left in the wake of the dead and the departed was deafening. The once vibrant rural culture, rich with music, storytelling, and the native language, was violently severed. Villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to overgrown foundations. The very landscape felt haunted, fundamentally altered by the absence of over 2 million souls. The trauma was so absolute, so incomprehensible, that for generations, the survivors could barely speak of the horrors they had witnessed. By 1852, the acute phase of the crisis had passed, but the demographic collapse was permanent. The population had plummeted from over 8 million to just over 6 million, and the hemorrhage of emigration would continue for another century. The Great Famine was not merely a tragic event. It was a cultural and linguistic death blow. It shattered the social fabric of the nation, instilling a deep, enduring bitterness toward the crown that would fuel revolutionary movements for generations to come. The horrific truth of this era remains a chilling testament to the dangers of ideological fanaticism and colonial indifference. It forces us to confront the grim reality that millions can be left to starve, while the land beneath their feet produces bounty, simply because human life is deemed less valuable than economic principle. The ghosts of 1845 do not rest easily. They linger in the ruined cottages, the famine roads, and the mass graves, a permanent unsettling reminder of the profound cruelty of which empires are capable.